Just in case you need a refresher, the eastern part of Germany was its own socialist country for roughly 40 years with a very complicated history. I thought, what if we took a look at the food of former socialist Germany and maybe even tried some of it? Nice idea, I thought, until I started doing some research. You see, food back then was either dominated by very simple and or heavily industrialized and, preserved products. And unless you have some deeply nostalgic connection to these dishes, I'm not sure they're really worth sharing for their culinary merits. But there was one thing that definitely sprung out at me, which is the ubiquitous use of something called Jagdwurst. It's basically just a type of sausage that was used in anything from soups to, well, schnitzel. Yes, you heard me right. If I had to name one specifically Eastern German specialty, it would definitely be the good old Jägerschnitzel, a cutlet made from the infamous East German sausage and served on spiral pasta with stretched out sweet tomato sauce. And that's something I have actually never tried in my life and decided to make for this video. But here's the thing, just like any other kid who was born in the Soviet Union or any other former communist Eastern European country, I know that sausage. Usually referred to as doktorskaya kolbasa or the doctor sausage, this was a legendary part of everyday life in socialist Europe. And not in an ironic way, no. People actually loved it and they get nostalgic about it to this day. And even though you can still buy it in Russian supermarkets around the world, it's not gonna taste the same, which we will definitely get to. But before we do, here's what I want to know. How did this dubious mystery meat become a beloved symbol of communist food planning? Can we come up with a recipe to recreate something that's at least close to the doctor sausage at home? Oh, and of course, where the hell does that name even come from? The doctor sausage. Good news, I have answers to all of these questions, and you know what? They might be more satisfying than the food itself. Let me explain. So in modern day Germany, Jagdwurst is actually a little bit of a joke, especially since we have this thing called face sausage. And it's exactly what it sounds like. And if you were a kid who grew up in Germany and you went to the supermarket with your parents, like the people at the meat counter, they'd give you a free slice of that. And of course, all the kids, they loved it. That was in the good old days. They don't really do that anymore. And if you think about it, it is a little bit creepy to offer kids free mystery meat. But broadly speaking, this type of sausage exists all over the world. In the United States, for example, it's famously known as bologna. And even though some people do like it, I'm definitely not gonna judge here, it's generally known to be a fairly low quality product. Which is mostly true, but it really doesn't have to be, especially if you consider the origins of mortadella, which is the grandfather of all of the aforementioned sausages. Okay, where do we start? So, first of all, the American term bologna is a pretty obvious nod to the Italian city of Bologna. In that city, you will find an archaeological museum. And inside that museum, you will find roughly 2,000-year-old stone carvings depicting, yes, the production of very early sausage. Okay, now little experiment, listen very closely, because what you can see in these stone carvings is that people are pounding meat with a mortar and then they're seasoning the meat with myrtle berries. And it's one of these two things that would give the resulting sausage its first Latin and then later on Italian name, mortadella. So meat was first pounded and seasoned, then stuffed into casings, then pre-cooked, and then later on, among other things, given to Roman soldiers as a form of very early day MRE. But it's definitely not a coincidence that these stone carvings are on display in Bologna. The city quickly became the global center of mortadella production, with up to a third of its people being involved in the industry sometime during the Middle Ages. And usually when you research food history, it's full of fairy tales and crazy stories, but this one, there's actually a lot of evidence to back this particular fact up. Check out this medieval ad that promotes mortadella as the king of sausages and meats, for example. But perhaps more importantly, sometime around the 14th century, a guild called the Salaroli was founded around mortadella production. And in 1661, local rulers passed an edict to strictly regulate and protect the production of the finest bologna. And I know it sounds a little bit like a joke, but to this day, you can find amazing high quality mortadella in the city of Bologna. If you can ever get your hands on it, try it. It tastes fantastic, and it's definitely up there with high-end ingredients like prosciutto. So, mortadella-style sausages originate somewhere in Bologna and then they spread all over Europe and far beyond, most famously to the United States, which went through a number of waves of Italian immigration, especially during the 19th century. It's pretty safe to assume that some folks from Bologna made their way over the big pond and ended up in the United States, and of course they brought mortadella with them. But what created modern-day American bologna was not them, it was something else. Industrialization. So, the population of the United States in the late 19th century was growing like crazy, especially in the big cities, and people had to eat. And it just so happens that during the same time, large-scale ranching, refrigeration, railroads, and modern-day entrepreneurship were taking off. Meat production used to be a highly localized, small-scale affair, you know, with your neighborhood farmer and butcher. But by the early 20th century in the United States, it turned into this huge, nationalized and highly regulated industry. Under these circumstances, bologna turned into a pretty popular product. I mean, think about it. You could use all sorts of undesirable cuts of meat and organs and even like little bits and pieces and trimmings, and you can just process them into something that looked, well, pink, and as long as you didn't think about it too much, it even tasted quite alright, and most importantly, it was really, really cheap, and that helped turning it into an all-American classic in no time. But while the USA were going through all of these changes, back in the old world, not everyone was on the same level. Russia, for example, was going through huge turmoil around that time, partly because the Tsars and the ruling class had failed to industrialize and modernize the country. We all know what happens next. The Russian Revolution shakes up the nation and the world, quite frankly, and the Soviet Union is born. This is where we finally get to communism. In the first few years of its existence, generally a very turbulent time, the country still managed to somehow gain a certain degree of stability and mobilize pretty impressive industrial capabilities. And as the leader of this emerging new superpower, Stalin quickly identified food security as one of the key aspects to Soviet success and handed the task of building up a new food industry, very powerful one, to the man who would change the lives of generations, Anastas Mikoyan. Mikoyan and Stalin were friends and political allies from way back, and they worked on all sorts of different things together. But when Stalin handed the task of food production to Mikoyan, that must have felt like his calling. One of his earliest achievements on that front was establishing the Soviet canned food industry sometime in the 1920s, but that was only the beginning. In the 1930s, Mikoyan was one of the very first Soviet leaders to visit the United States on goodwill trips to boost economic cooperation. He actually spent a whole 3 months in the United States researching its food industry and logistics. And when he returned, Mikoyan introduced a whole number of American consumer favorites to the Soviet Union. Hamburgers, ice cream, cornflakes, tomato juice, popcorn, grapefruit, corn on the cob, just to name a few. But aside from that, what Mikoyan did was actually quite profound. He shifted the whole Soviet food system kind of away from these gigantic mass canteens that would feed hundreds and maybe thousands of workers at the same time, back into the humble home kitchen. And he wrote a book to go along with it. The Book of Tasty and Healthy Food, which is easily the most influential cookbook in Soviet history. Mikoyan's proudest achievement, though, was establishing and meticulously overseeing the Soviet ice cream industry, which, you know, I can confirm with my own first-hand memories growing up in the Soviet Union for the last 3 years of its existence. That Russian Soviet ice cream is legendary. Even Stalin himself used to joke, "You, Anastas, care more about ice cream than about communism." But to get back to sausages, one of Mikoyan's most important objectives on that research trip to the United States was understanding this highly industrialized American meat industry and figure out how to provide the people of the Soviet Union with protein. And don't be fooled by his love for snacks and ice cream. Mikoyan was a pretty smart guy. In collaboration with some of the Soviet Union's best scientists and nutritionists, he came up with this whole catalog of meaty innovations. And if you take a look inside, you'll immediately notice all these sausages featuring a hyper smooth pink interior with varying amounts of meat chunks and fat sprinkled in. So yeah, you can definitely tell how much Mikoyan was inspired by good old American bologna. Either way, this catalog would become the foundation of Soviet kolbasa culture. Within just a few years, Mikoyan's sausages and other meat products would become staples in every corner of the country. But one sausage was smoother than them all. Doktorskaya kolbasa. This one was special in many ways. It was actually personally commissioned by Joseph Stalin. Back then, lots of people in the Soviet Union were suffering from digestive issues, caused by decades of war and malnutrition. And it was seen as critically important to provide these people with protein that was easy to digest. And Mikoyan's solution to this type of issue was developing a very low-fat bologna that was specifically made from very, very high-quality lean meat. It would be boiled, not smoked, and only seasoned with salt, sugar, and like a little bit of cardamom and maybe a touch of nutmeg. To increase the nutritional value even further, small amounts of eggs and milk were permitted, but nothing else. No additives. Basically, the type of sausage your mid-20th century doctor would recommend for a healthy diet. And somewhat surprisingly, this one actually turned out to be really, really delicious. The team around Mikoyan was so proud of their new product that they actually wanted to name it after Stalin himself at first. But then they realized maybe calling something Stalin's wiener wasn't the best idea, so they stuck with the doctor theme. And the rest is kind of history. Selling sausages and processed meat is just a heck of a lot easier, more cost efficient, and more reliable. And so as soon as the doctor sausage hits the shelves, just like it did in so many other countries, it becomes an instant classic. Not just among sick people, but pretty much among everyone in the Soviet Union. But hey, don't take it from me. We can talk to somebody who was actually around for the early days of Dr. Sausage. Yes, I'm talking about my grandmother, who was an actual kid in the Soviet Union in the 1940s.
Как я выгляжу?
Великолепно.
Я немножко привела себя в порядок. Понятие «докторская колбаса» сегодня уже вызывает ностальгическое чувство. Это понятие места, времени, дома, семьи, запаха. Когда мама приносила сумку с продуктами, то она еще не раскрывая сумки, мы чувствовали, что там есть докторская колбаса. У нее был невероятно приятный, но убедительный запах, который наполнял не только кухню, но и комнаты. Она стоила приличные по тем временам деньги, поэтому в нашем доме не всегда была докторская колбаса. Когда она была, это было чувство, если не праздника, то удовольствия, несомненно. Докторская колбаса стала уже знаком времени. Если что-то хотели сравнить с качеством, говорили, это не докторская колбаса.
Look, I understand. A processed sausage doesn't look super appealing to somebody from a rich Western country these days, but back in the day, it was a huge deal.
Все-таки вот в этом впечатлении нельзя откинуть понятие, когда деревья были большими. Потому что в детстве все вкусно, особенно в голодном детстве, когда все время хотелось есть, даже не вкусненького, а просто есть хотелось. Это детское ощущение, действительно ощущение вкуса. Я его даже могу разложить, я даже чувствую его.
You gotta know that after the terrifying years of the Second World War, Dr. Sausage was actually a little beacon of hope in people's lives. Unfortunately, the Cold War definitely took a toll on the Soviet people. Things didn't actually look too bad up until the early 60s, but then the Soviet Union took a political turn and started militarizing and pouring all that money into missiles instead of moon rovers or sausages for the people. Obviously, food planning also got a little bit off track, and the quality of the beloved Dr. Sausage just wasn't the same anymore.
Конечно. Дело в том, что качество многих продуктов изменилось, почти всех. Почти всех. Поэтому и докторская колбаса тоже стала уже не та. Докторская колбаса прежняя могла конкурировать с ветчиной. Она тоже была со слезой. Она была такая сочная, и даже чуть влажненькая. До, наверное, начала, середины, вот где-то 60-е годы, она уже начала портиться. Уже даже не по субъективным впечатлениям, а уже люди стали говорить. Уже не то. Уже со слезой докторской колбасу было не встретить.
Especially by the 1980s, when the Soviet Union was in deep economic trouble, this sausage would get watered down with all sorts of random stuff. Bone powder, soy products, starch, and all sorts of other additives were just stuffed into it to just keep up with basic demand.